Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Philip Sanders, Assistant City Manager, and I'm going to walk through a little bit of background on this order.
Oh, 1 second.
Sir.
Anybody who is still wanting to talk, if you could go on out so we can hear better for his presentation, or feel free to come and sit down and listen.
Thank you for making time for staff to present this to you. Also recognize those who came to provide their public comment. I know how nerve-wracking it can be to speak to a group that you've never spoken to before, not knowing whether you're going to be cheered or booed, and certainly recognize and appreciate the efforts that they've made to come out and share their opinions with you tonight. Met several of them before the meeting and was able to shake hands. Again, what I would like to do tonight is walk through the background of this ordinance, kind of the PUD 6 property itself, kind of talk about what the ordinance is, walk through the mechanics of the ordinance, how it works, what the regulatory structure is, and then answer any questions that the Commission has about the ordinance and how it would operate. So a little bit of background. The former stadium site, which is kind of a generic name for this area surrounding the former Texas Stadium, was identified a number of years ago as a catalyst site while the city was developing its comprehensive plan. There was about 1,000 acres, 450 or so, which is buildable, that excludes floodplain and future roadways, that was identified. And it was clear at the time that those who were looking at this, that this would be a very important area for the city's future development. It was largely an industrial area previously. The old Central Freight trucking facility was there on one of the larger tracts of land. The stadium site had just been demolished. There was adjacent property owned by the University of Dallas, and it was clear that this could be a really transformational area for the city in terms of future development. So they had three goals that I identified that they would like to look at, and by they I mean those who were developing the comprehensive plan at the time. They wanted to facilitate zoning clarity, so as this property redeveloped in the future, there would be clear identifying a regulatory structure. Wanted to remove objectionable uses that might not contribute to the overall transformation of this site, primarily those industrial uses on the majority of the property, and then permit a broad mix of uses that would be complementary to the light rail station, which was planned for that property. Mix of uses could include retail, residential, entertainment, office, hotel types uses. This was really the concept that was developed for this property or envisioned. There was some direction given at the time that a new planned unit development district known as PUD 6 should be looked at prior to really completing the comprehensive plan. They really wanted to take action and do that. So PUD 6 was actually developed and adopted. I think it was written and reviewed and adopted over the course of about a 6-month period in 2015. And it encompassed this 1,000-acre tract that we identified. There was the intent of the PUD 6, Planned Unit Development Number 6, was really three purposes that are identified in the Exhibit B to that ordinance, which is to really make full use of this property as a city asset. Envisioning, again, that broad mix of uses, contemplating something that would be a national and really an international destination. And then a regulatory structure that would allow the city to facilitate development, working with the developer, and then providing clarity so that the site would be suitable for adjacent uses. So that was the vision and intent of the PUD 6 regulatory structure to begin with. It is divided into 8 tracts. They're titled A through H. Each tract had a unique mix of uses that was permitted on each. They had minimums and maximums in terms of non-residential and residential development. Tracts A, D, F, and G. Tract D, for your reference, is the city's property that's the former site of the Texas Stadium. Tract A is the subject property of this ordinance tonight. And F and G are owned by the University of Dallas. It was envisioned that those would be transit-oriented developments. By transit-oriented development, we mean a development that would link transportation and land use. providing people with really maximum choice of how they get around, and really intensifying that land use at transit nodes where you might have light rail stations, making and allowing a more intensive use. It typically would be a mix of uses, residential, commercial types of uses that would be all kind of living harmoniously in a transit-oriented development. So tracts B and C were identified as flex work. You can see that's on the eastern side of 183, on the north and the south side toward the eastern end of the property. By flex work, it was primarily an industrial area. They had some trucking businesses, and it made sense that those would continue to be more of an industrial area. Tract E was envisioned as a mixed-use village. By mixed-use village, it meant that it could include residential, but some supporting commercial as well. Tract E is mostly developed today. It includes residential, single-family properties, and some multifamily properties as well. Tract G was rezoned out of PUD 6 in 2024. There was a zoning case that University of Dallas submitted to allow more of an industrial type use on that property, specifically a data center. That zoning case was approved, and so Tract G is really no longer part of PUD 6. And Tract H, the green along the top there, was exclusively open space. It's floodplain, it's beyond the levee system, and really not suitable for development. There's 3 primary landowners: a Village Walk Realty 2, which is the owner of Tract A, sectors 1 and 2. By sectors 1 and 2, you can see there's a couple different shades of pink. The 2 darker shades of pink in Tract A constitute sectors 1 and 2. Sector 3 is actually the FedEx facility. City of Irving, as I mentioned before, owns Tract D, and then University of Dallas owns Tracts F and G. So in 2023, the Planning Department staff initiated a review of the PUD 6 regulations. In October of that same year, we presented some kind of a summary of the findings, along with some recommendations to clarify and improve the regulatory structure of PUD 6. Specifically in mind that we hadn't had a lot of development in PUD 6, with the exception of Tract E, where we had some residential and multifamily development. And there was a concern that we really needed to address some issues that staff had identified since the ordinance was adopted in 2015. So we presented those to the City Council. I think, Jocelyn, am I correct, this was also presented to the Planning and Zoning Commission as well. And the Council asked us to kind of initiate meetings with the property owners, have some discussions, and as those discussions progress, bring back some specific proposals to the City Council that could be reviewed. There was, during the time that we were having these conversations, the new owner of Tract A, which is Village Walk Realty 2, identified the possibility of unique and significant development opportunity, this concept of a destination resort. And this was a new concept, and so we really paused our work on updating the PUD 6 document in order to better understand how that new opportunity might fit within the larger effort to improve the regulatory structure of PUD 6. So the current zoning proposal is an outcome of conversations with the owner, Village Walk 2, and understanding what their development aspirations are and could be. But it is also an outgrowth or a continuation of the city's effort to clarify and improve the regulatory structure of PUD 6 through a city-initiated rezoning of the Village Walk 2 property. It also addresses concerns that were identified by Village Walk 2 that could impair their ability to maximize the potential development. One of those was making room for this concept of a destination resort. Would that be allowed? That was a question. But there was other issues related to density. There was some density caps on residential, or excuse me, non-residential development that were pretty restrictive. And when we listened and learned about what the types of development that could be built on this property, they would far exceed those density caps. So that was a concern as well. There was also a concern about phasing. In the current PUD 6 document, it requires a residential component be included in each phase of the development in Tract A. And that was a concern because that may not be how this property naturally develops. We also wanted to clarify permitted uses and allow flexibility to maximize future development opportunities for transformational development, as we talked about, specifically this concept of a destination resort. And we also wanted to establish a process for adopting development standards that promote quality. So there was this idea of looking at, okay, what is the developer trying to accomplish, and how can that be accommodated in a regulatory structure that still ensures that the quality of the development overall, the city would have some control over how that develops, and that there was some development standards to promote that quality. So that's the other thing that we're trying to ensure as we drafted this ordinance. The new zoning district regulations and development standards would only apply to Tract A sectors 1 and 2, that which is owned by Village Walk 2. You can see that property is identified in purple on this map, and Village Walk 2 is the primary owner. There's a drainage channel that is owned by Irving Flood Control District number 1, which is a small piece that runs through the property. The DART rail line owned by Dallas Area Rapid Transit around the perimeter is owned by DART. And there's a small vestige of a tract of land owned by the city of Irving. When they built the Signature Bridge, that bridge extended across the 114 right-of-way, so the city acquired some property to accommodate the extension of that bridge across 114. All the remaining tracts, including the FedEx property, all tracts B, C, D, and F, and H will all remain in PUD 6 as they're presently zoned. So the only property affected by this zoning proposal is what you see identified in purple. So the proposed amendments, there's 2 proposed amendments. The first one is probably the most consequential. It is the creation of a high-density mixed-use zoning district for PUD 6. The purpose and intent is outlined in the preamble of the ordinance, really to create an identifiable multi-use area that encourages concentrated development in the same structures or in proximity in an exciting, engaging environment that maximizes the value of the property within PUD 6. It establishes permitted uses. It establishes a process for creating and approving development standards, which are really quite important. And it establishes an administrative process for approving regulating plans as the property develops. I'm going to walk through kind of the full ordinance with you and kind of map out how this all flows together. It's a fairly simple ordinance in its structure. The second ordinance is to amend PUD 6 Exhibit B and designate this property, Tract A Sectors 1 and 2, for high-intensity mixed-use area that would conform to the requirements of this zoning district we're creating. So we're creating this zoning category and then assigning that zoning category and all its rules to Tract A Sectors 1 and 2. So it's a 2-step process. After the purpose and intent, we get into the permitted uses. And what I've done here is to compare what the existing regulatory structure is on the left for transit-oriented mixed use with what is proposed in this new high-intensity mixed-use area. In a transit-oriented mixed-use area, they don't identify specific permitted uses. It talks about including multifamily, townhouse, neighborhood commercial, commercial office, so this mix of residential and commercial. But there are no uses that are specifically included in the TOD district as expressly permitted. Any use that you would assign to a TOD district would have to be assigned at the time you're creating the TOD through the zoning process. So you would have to list all the various specific uses that you intend to allow in that TOD. It does have some minimum densities for multifamily to really encourage high-density multifamily in the TOD district. In the high-intensity mixed-use district, we're proposing to expressly list permitted uses. You can see that this is a broad mix of residential, commercial, retail uses. There are 3 uses identified with an asterisk that are defined terms in the ordinance: arena, casino gaming, only if within a destination resort, and the destination resort itself is also a defined term. And I'll walk through those with you here in a minute. We also identify prohibited uses. In the current transit-oriented mixed-use district, there are no expressly prohibited uses. Again, it's silent on uses, depending on the applicant to propose uses through the TOD process is how that works. Jocelyn, shake your head or not if I'm getting any of that wrong, but I think I'm right on that. In the proposed high-density mixed-use district, we're enumerating specific uses that would be prohibited, which would not be consistent with what would be envisioned as this high-intensity mixed-use area, mostly kind of industrial uses that wouldn't be compatible. Of course, undesirable uses like sexually oriented businesses were listed. But again, the idea is to enumerate those uses that could not be built in this high-intensity mixed-use district. We also talk about other uses. From time to time, there are temporary uses. The ordinance allows temporary uses to go through the process that's already laid out in the zoning ordinance for approval of temporary uses, where a person can go to the city council and get approval not exceeding 6 months for temporary types of uses. We also recognize that as property develops and as the world moves forward, there may be other types of uses that are not identified, that we aren't contemplating today, that if they're proposed might be something that the city would be interested in. So we have expressly allowed that if there's an unidentified use, they can request that use through the conditional use permit process, which is really a zoning process, but establishes a very specific permit for a use that might be identified. Alcohol sales would be permitted consistent with what we have in Chapter 3.3 of the Unified Development Code. In PUD 6, that means that the alcohol-to-food ratio in a restaurant is a 30-70 ratio that's permitted in PUD 6, as well as the Heritage District and Toyota Music Factory, so it's consistent with those 2 areas. So let's talk about the destination resort, because this is where the permissiveness of the gaming is permitted. All these other uses, gaming is permitted only within the destination resort. So it's important how you define that. It is defined, this is almost verbatim from paragraph G of the ordinance. It is a mixed-use entertainment complex that has to include, at minimum, all of the amenities and components you see listed in bullets below. One or more hotels with a combined minimum guest rooms of 1,750 guest rooms. By context, I think the Westin has about 350 guest rooms, so this would be very substantial hotel development. Spas, pools, restaurants, retail stores, also convention, exhibition/meeting facilities, a minimum of 500,000 square feet. This is probably the component that sets it apart, that's different than what you see in other casino resorts. They typically include very little convention space. The requirement in this definition would have to be 500,000 square feet, which is very, very large. I think our convention center is a little over 270,000 square feet. Again, and it would also have to include either an arena with 15,000 seats or an indoor theater for live entertainment and performance with a minimum of 4,000 square feet, 4,000 seats. All these components would have to exist, that's the floor, in order for a destination resort to be able to allow casino gaming if it's authorized by the Constitution and laws of the state. It would have to comply with whatever rules the state sets up relative to how gaming would operate in Texas. As you know, it's not legal today, but this is, would allow it if, in the event it becomes legal, in compliance with the regulatory structure that the state sets up. The gross square footage of a destination resort that includes casino gaming would have to be at least 4 million square feet. This is very, very large. If you think about the Pioneer Natural Resources corporate office is about 1 million square feet. It's a very big building. Wells Fargo, the two campuses, the two big buildings they're building there, 800,000 square feet between the two buildings. The minimum of this resort would have to be 4 million square feet. And I just throw out those numbers so you can kind of have some context about the size we're talking about. It's important that how you define destination resort, and we had thought a lot about what that would be and what those minimums would be, because, as has been pointed out, zoning is agnostic. It doesn't care about the owner. It can only enforce what the words say it can enforce. So there was a lot of thought that went into, okay, how do we set this apart and make sure that it's something transformational? These are the minimums. This is the floor. Also, a destination resort is contemplated that would be either within a single structure, but more than likely in interconnected structures, as approved on a regulating plan. There might be other uses besides restaurants, pools, retail stores that are part of a destination resort, but those would have to be enumerated on a regulating plan. And I'll talk about that regulating plan and the administrative process for how that regulating plan could get approved. But first, let's talk about development standards. So if uses are, and I think I used this analogy when I was talking to the City Council, if uses are kind of the skeletal structure of a zoning ordinance, because that's typically what you think about in zoning is these are permitted, these are not permitted, and those are important. The development standards are really kind of the internal organs that make the thing work, that ensure a level of quality to the development. In the existing TOD, or transit-oriented mixed-use district, there are some development standards. They're enumerated and listed, and they regulate a number of things: driveways, streetscapes, building heights, massing, lighting, parking. All these types of things are regulated in the TOD district. The TOD district is, I don't know, it's probably over 10 years old in terms of, I don't know, Justin, do you know how old the TOD development standards are? Maybe Ken? Okay. Well, they're not new, and they haven't been revisited for a while. So we just didn't want to defer to the TOD development standards if we're talking about a new creature. And this high-intensity mixed-use district really is a new creation. It will take some time to develop those and create those development standards. So what we have established in the ordinance is that no application for a regulating plan, which is a prerequisite for development, could be considered or adopted without prior approval by the City Council of the development standards. So we outline a process that the developer of the property is going to have to propose development standards that have to be approved by the City Council first before anything can be built. And those development standards are going to address a number of things. Again, streets, widths, right-of-way, parkways, sidewalks, building heights, massing. We're anticipating we'll have minimum building heights in this district for various types of uses. The setbacks, where they're located on the property, where parking is located, surface parking versus structured parking, hotel development standards. What do those look like in this high-intensity mixed-use district? Public plazas, special signs. There's all types of things that would be included in these development standards, and that will be a process to develop. We anticipate that would be a collaborative process with the property owner and the city working together to identify a reasonable regulatory structure for those development standards that would be submitted ultimately to the Planning and Zoning Commission, because this would be an amendment to this ordinance, and then to the City Council for final approval. So then we get to the administrative process. In the TOD mixed-use district, in this PUD, or planned unit development, all development plans are approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission. The City Council would have to approve anything that would be inconsistent with the PUD. If you were proposing uses that were different or not allowed in the PUD, then those would have to go to the City Council. But by and large, if you're complying with all the PUD rules, the Planning and Zoning Commission is the final say. And I think you had one of those development plans on your agenda last night. I believe that was approved, and that approval is it. That approval doesn't have to go to the City Council. And they include development plan submissions, can include a variety of things that you would want to look at, depending on the complexity of the development. I think the one last night was for an RAB, am I correct, Ken? So it was fairly simple, and there wasn't a lot of complexity to that. In a regulating plan under this district, there is a lot of information the developer will have to submit. The street configurations, the street cross-sections, access to highways, building locations, typology, size, use, the permitted land uses generally that are going to be allowed in that development plan. Whether or not a destination resort is part of that development plan, or excuse me, regulating plan would have to be identified in that submittal. Parking locations, drainage, utility plans, phasing lines, a lot of complex information that you typically don't see in a zoning request. But because they're submitting this under this high-intensity mixed use, we felt it was important that there's a high level of detail that would have to be submitted. Traffic studies, if they're necessary. How are you going to handle drainage? How are you going to handle utilities? Are the utilities adequate for the type of development that you're being proposed? All that would have to be reviewed in a development plan. We anticipate that that wouldn't be simply them submitting an application saying, here's my development plan. We anticipate that that would be a conversation with the developer, understanding what things work, what doesn't work. All that information ultimately reviewed internally, then presented to the City Council for final approval. So in this administrative process, first you have to develop the development standards. That has to be done first. They can't develop anything without that. And then, once those are approved and adopted, they have to submit this regulating plan that identify all this level of detail that we would want to see in a development proposal. And these are examples of the type of information, but I think the last bullet in this section, I, says any other information that we need in order to properly review the proposal. So during the course of the review, maybe we might identify something that, hey, we need you to help us understand what you're doing here, and we could ask for that. So that in a nutshell is this high-intensity mixed-use district. Kind of walk through every section with you, how it works. In structure, it's a fairly simple ordinance and allows the city, I think somebody mentioned 2 bites of the apple in terms of looking at a development before it's finally submitted. First, the development standards have to be created, then the regulating plan has to be submitted and approved. The second ordinance is this amendment to the PUD 6 Exhibit B, which is identified, which was the primary concern when we looked at PUD 6 initially, was how does Exhibit B work? And so how this would work is that we would propose to amend Exhibit B to allow Tract A Sectors 1 and 2 to be regulated under the high-intensity mixed-use district. We would remove all references to the TOD as it applies to that, remove all references to Tract G as kind of a cleanup because that was already removed from the PUD, revise updated references, kind of housekeeping items. The main issue is kind of putting this high-intensity mixed-use regulatory structure as it applies to Tract A Sectors 1 and 2, and then kind of cutting off any connections that aren't relevant anymore. And that's what you see in this amendment to Exhibit B. So by way of comparison, the land use designation in this proposal would be high-intensity mixed use instead of transit-oriented mixed use. We would keep the cap on number of residential units at 3,750. That's the cap that exists today for Tract A sectors 1 and 2. We're not proposing to increase that or affect that. That would remain. The maximum number of residential square feet, we're not regulating because units should be really the thing we're concerned about, not how many square feet it occupies. But we are removing the cap on non-residential square footage to allow a much more dense development. In the development standards, what we're proposing is development standards that would be more akin to a form-based code. A form-based code addresses land uses, but it is much more concerned with focus on the physical form of the development, the height, the setbacks, the relationship of the buildings to the street, where parking is located. It focuses on creating quality spaces where you have public amenities. How do those fit in? It is really more consistent with a dense urban core than a suburban mall or strip center type development. That's, if you can kind of envision, that would be the difference between what would be more form-based regulations versus solely paying attention to use. A form-based code is more restrictive, whereas utility and zoning, which we have today, is really less restrictive because it's only paying attention mostly to land uses. It has a few development standards, but those are secondary. The land use is the primary thing. In a form-based code, land use regulations exist, but you're also looking at the physical form of the development. So future related amendments, as I said, this ordinance really lays out a regulatory structure which requires some additional steps before the developer can actually use it to develop. The first thing they'd have to do is make those development standards, which would be an amendment to this ordinance itself. We also recognize that there may be a need to amend the hotel development standards. We have, kind of unique in Irving, a very specific requirements for how hotels develop. We regulate the number of rooms and the amenities that have to be in each. Where if you have a hotel in a destination resort, that may create some new development requirements that we would want that are specific to that concept. And so we would have to go back into our existing hotel development standards and kind of carve out the place for whatever is adopted in lieu of what we currently have today. And then we'd be looking to amend Chapter 3.3 in the Unified Development Code to create distinct alcohol regulations for certain areas, the destination resort specifically within the PUD 6 high-intensity use mixed-use district. And really the challenge here is in a destination resort concept, you may have 40, 50, 60, 70 food and beverage vendors, restaurants of all kinds of different. And you may have some bars, you may have restaurants, and they may have individual operators. The way our ordinance is written right now is that each one of those would have to comply with the 30-70 rule, where it may make more sense to try to aggregate those percentages over all of the food and beverage outlets in a restaurant, or excuse me, a destination resort. That's not the only way we could address the issue, but that's one of the ways. There's going to have to be some thought into that issue and how that's presented. But I wanted to be transparent and let you know that that's another issue that we need to tackle relative to the high-intensity mixed-use district and how it regulates alcohol. So we've talked about the next steps. The Planning and Zoning Commission is, we're holding our work session today. The notices to the property owners and adjacent property owners have been mailed out today, I believe, Jocelyn, okay? We'll post signs on the property as is our customary requirement. We would anticipate bringing back this ordinance for public hearing, planning and zoning deliberation on March 17th. Ultimately, the City Council could consider and hold another public hearing on this on March 20th if they so choose. One of the questions that was raised is, why this schedule? As we visited with the property owner about this zoning concept, whether or not the gaming component would be permitted in Irving is a significant question for them. And so they have asked for clarity on that sooner rather than later. We had proposed a schedule to the City Council that would laid out, here's the quickest we could provide that answer going through all the regulatory processes. We presented that schedule to the City Council on Thursday last week, received consensus direction to take the next step, which is to submit it to the Planning and Zoning Commission, have this work session, and then ultimately submit it for a hearing.